wounds. The German tank commanders knew it. Oberstleutnant Karl-Heinz Bremer, a fictional composite of many such officers, sat in his Panther's turret before dawn, smoking his last cigarette for the day. He was 37, already older than most men expected to live in this war. He had fought in Poland, France, Russia, and now here, France again, but this time as the hunted. His motivation was no longer ideology. It was duty, habit, and the men under his command. He knew the Americans were nearby. He did not yet know how close, or how fast they were coming. Patton, meanwhile, was awake before sunrise, standing over maps with his staff. His eyes burned with energy. He had identified the Panzer concentration through reconnaissance and intercepted signals. Where another general might have paused, consolidated, or waited for air support, Patton saw opportunity. He ordered a multi-pronged advance, armored spearheads to punch through, infantry to follow and seal the flanks, artillery to roll forward in perfectly timed barrages. His orders were simple and terrifying in their clarity: move now, move fast, and do not stop. At 0600 hours, the American artillery opened up. It was not a blind bombardment but a surgical one. Shells slammed into German assembly areas, command posts, and fuel dumps. Radios crackled with confusion. German officers shouted for reports that never came. Before the dust had settled, American Shermans were already advancing, their engines roaring like unleashed beasts. Bremer's unit was hit while still maneuvering into formation. One moment his tanks were rolling along a sunken road, the next, the world exploded. A Panther ahead of him vanished in a fireball, its turret flipping into the air like a child's toy. Bremer shouted orders, trying to establish a defensive line, but the Americans were everywhere. They came from unexpected directions, exploiting gaps that German doctrine would never have allowed, but doctrine meant little against speed and aggression. Patton's genius that morning was not technological, it was temporal. He attacked faster than the Germans could think. American armored columns did not pause to admire their kills. They bypassed resistance, leaving pockets to be mopped up by following infantry. Radios hummed with calm, efficient voices. Forward observers called in artillery with deadly precision. Above it all, American fighter-bombers swooped down, strafing roads and blasting tanks caught in the open. By 0730, the German Panzer force was already breaking apart. Units lost contact with one another. Commanders made decisions in isolation, often contradictory. Bremer found himself engaging multiple Shermans at once. His gunner knocked out one, then another, but for every American tank destroyed, two more seemed to appear. A rocket slammed into his engine compartment. The Panther lurched to a halt, smoke pouring from the rear. Bremer ordered his crew to abandon the vehicle. As they ran for cover, he looked back at the machine that had carried him across half of Europe. It burned like a funeral pyre. By mid-morning, the battle was effectively over. What was left of the Panzer force was either destroyed, scattered, or retreating in small, disorganized groups. The Americans pressed on relentlessly. Patton himself moved forward, visiting command posts, urging his men onward. "Keep them running," he reportedly said. "And don't let them stop." One staff officer later recalled that Patton looked almost joyful, not at the destruction, but at the purity of the maneuver. War, conducted properly, was an art. And yes, one might imagine him letting out a sharp, satisfied laugh. At how completely the plan had worked. The human cost, however, was stark. The fields around Avranches were littered with wrecked tanks, shattered vehicles, and bodies. German soldiers surrendered in droves, dazed and exhausted. American medics worked tirelessly, treating wounded on both sides. This was not a bloodless triumph, but it was decisive. Word reached German headquarters within hours, and the reaction was immediate and stunned. At Wolfslair in East Prussia, the mood was grim. Reports came in fragmented and contradictory, but the conclusion was unavoidable. An entire panzer force had been effectively neutralized in a single morning by Patton's Third Army. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel reportedly slammed his fist on the table. "Impossible," he said. "An exaggeration." But the follow-up reports only made it worse. General Alfred Jodl read them in silence, his face growing pale. The Americans had not only broken through, they had annihilated a counterattack before it could even begin. Hitler, as always, refused to accept reality. He blamed commanders, weather, betrayal. "Patton is reckless," he raged. "He will overextend and destroy himself." Yet privately, among the professional officers, a different tone emerged. One senior staff officer was overheard saying, "This is not recklessness. This is mastery." Another reportedly remarked, "If we had 10 men like Patton, the war would already be over, on our terms." What the German High Command said next would echo quietly through their internal communications, never intended for propaganda or morale. In a memorandum circulated among senior officers, Patton was described as a commander of exceptional operational speed, whose actions defy our expectations and calculations. Another note, colder and more ominous, stated, "Where Patton appears, a stable front cannot exist." For Bremer, the war continued, but in a different form. He was captured 2 days later, exhausted and hollow. In a POW camp, he learned the full scope of what had happened that morning. An entire panzer force, assembled with desperate hope, erased in hours. He did not feel shame so much as a weary clarity. They had been outthought, outmaneuvered, and outpaced. The Americans were no longer students of war. They were practitioners. Patton, for his part, did not dwell on the victory. By afternoon, he was already planning the next advance. His Third Army would race across France, liberating towns, crossing rivers, and keeping the German army perpetually off balance. That single morning became a turning point, not because of the number of tanks destroyed, but because it shattered a myth. The myth that the Germans could still control the tempo of the war. Historians would later debate the exact numbers, the precise timelines, the contributing factors. Air power, logistics, intelligence, all played their part. But even the German High Command, stripped of excuses, recognized the truth in private. They had encountered a commander who understood modern warfare at its most brutal and efficient level. When Patton crushed that panzer force in a single morning, he did more than win a battle. He sent a message that traveled faster than any tank or aircraft. It reached Berlin, East Prussia, and every German officer still clinging to hope. The message was simple, terrifying, and undeniable. The war had entered a phase they could no longer control, and George S. Patton was leading the charge.